Welcome everyone to another YIVO Fellowship lecture. Our lecturer today is Dina Ecker. She's a PhD candidate at the Graduate Center at CUNY, and she teaches American history at the City College of New York. Her dissertation, Painted Vicious Hussies, Prostitutes' Impact on Business, Leisure, and Sex in Early 20th Century New York, looks at the integral role that sex workers played in shaping the urban, social, cultural, and economic environment of New York in that time period. She received the Rose and Isidore Drench Memorial Fellowship and the Dora and Mayer Tendler Endowed Fellowship in American Jewish Studies at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research for the year 2024-2025. The title of her lecture is Nafkas on the Stoop, Prostitutes' Impact on the Lower East Side of New York in the Early 20th Century. And I'll just note again that this lecture was funded by the Rose and Isidore Drench Memorial Fellowship and the Dora and Mayer Tendler Endowed Fellowship in American Jewish Studies. If you do have questions for Dina at the end or at any time, really, please leave them in the Q&A section of the Zoom, not the chat. Questions go in the Q&A section. Now, please join me in welcoming Dina Ecker.
Thank you so much, Eddie. Okay. Michael Gold opens his book, Jews Without Money, with a description of the streets of New York's Lower East Side. Gold paints a dirty picture, one of noise and misery. He highlights the crying, yelling, fighting, and anger of the poor Jewish experience. And right in the middle of all of that misery were the prostitutes. As Gold says, quote, "The whores sat on the chairs along the sidewalk. They sprawled their legs indolently. People stumbled over a gauntlet of whores' meaty legs." Now, I'm going to share a video so we can look and see what Gold was talking about. Let me just go back a little. Sorry. So what we're looking at here is a video of the Lower East Side from the YIVO archives. And we can see here that the tenements, which are on the, the buildings right here, and the streets, they're almost a fluid kind of space. And people are negotiating with each other, negotiating over space, over money. Haggling. We see women here, they're shopping, they're socializing, maybe they're flirting a little bit. We have our rag pickers. Just getting an idea of what this Jewish immigrant experience was like. One peddler selling talit, so it's secular and religious combined. And this is the image that I think we use. You might have seen as part of the as the what's called the image for the lecture. So let's talk about what we just looked at. The scenes that Gold described are mirrored in the video that we just saw. We can see the fighting between the peddlers and their customers, the jostling between the customers themselves. We also saw women socializing, purchasing, and flirting with young men. There are children playing mixed in with the rag pickers and the fishmongers. And if you look closely, you can see the women on the stoop. Maybe these women are the housewives yelling at each other that Gold described, but it's also possible that they are the women calling out to men as they walk by, inviting them in, promising them a good time. Gold's description of prostitutes as being a visible blight on immigrant Jewish life was not incorrect. However, prostitutes were so much more than that. They were at the center of this economic ecosystem of the immigrant Jewish experience, earning money by selling men their sexual services, but also employing lookouts, laundresses, and kind of indirectly the investigators who the vice reform committees hired to surveil the residents who lived and worked in the tenements as prostitutes and purveyors of vice. In March of 1901, a police detective from New York City's Eldridge Street Station on the Lower East Side knocked on the door of a man named Jacob Creasworth, who was a resident of 102 Allen Street and also happened to be employed as an investigator for the Committee of 15. The Committee of 15 was New York's vice reform committee that functioned around that time of 1901. According to Creasworth, the detective, quote, asked me if I knew of any disorderly girls in the house. I told him I did not know anybody who kept disorderly girls. He then went to every apartment in the house and asked the same questions. Every tenant in the house told the detective there were no disorderly girls in the house. Nearly every tenant in the house makes a living off of these girls, end quote. Creasworth saw firsthand the microeconomy that existed within this particular tenement. When prostitutes brought men into their homes for the purposes of selling sex, they added a layer of sexuality and sexual commerce to working class tenements that already teemed with economic exchange, familial relationships, and neighborly negotiation, like what we saw in the video. The economic relationship between landlord and tenant was only one way that money was flowing in the tenements. Domestic work, the sale of small goods between neighbors, tenants taking on boarders, and piecework done in the home all meant that labor and monetary exchange constituted a daily part of tenement life. When prostitutes lived in the building, they seamlessly inserted themselves into this microeconomy. The ways that prostitutes constructed their families was tied to the sexual economy in the tenements, but also, in some ways, did not differ from how other working class immigrants constructed familial economic relationships. Living in the close quarters of the tenements meant that the residents had to negotiate with each other over things like sound, smell, cleanliness, and space. Prostitutes participated in these negotiations, but their presence often meant that additional strains to those relationships, with men coming in and going out of the building at all hours of the day and night, loud arguments surrounding the sexual economy, and contestations over who was entitled to which spaces in the building. In their homes, we can see how prostitutes impacted the daily lives of neighbors, children, and their families more directly than in other spaces of the urban environment. The domestic space allows us to understand that instead of being alienated from family, prostitutes constructed families around their sexual labor as mothers, daughters, wives, and sisters. The tenements show us these women as members of families, neighbors, businesswomen, workers, consumers, and creators of the sexual culture in which they participated and perpetuated. By looking at the streets and tenements on the Lower East Side, we see a kaleidoscope of experiences of prostitutes and the people who lived among them, how they created ecosystems of economic support and navigated the challenges of the more private space of the home being regularly infiltrated by outsiders, whether that be customers, investigators, or building owners. Now, just a pause here to say, you might be wondering if I should even be using the term prostitute instead of the more common sex worker that we most often hear today. This is a debate that historians of sex work frequently have. I personally choose to use the word prostitute, particularly in this lecture, for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, for my purposes, sex worker is a broad term that includes a variety of forms of labor. I am particularly looking at women who exchange money for direct physical sexual acts. There are other parts of my research that engage with other forms of sex work, such as performance. It's important to me to be precise. I just want to say this is not me putting any kind of moral judgment on the women or the labor that they performed. So, back to our show. We're going to focus in today on one particular tenement that received the most scrutiny on the Committee of 15 investigation in 1901, which was 102 Allen Street. This was one of the earliest investigations, starting in March of 1901, and the most well-documented address under investigation by this committee. The building was owned by Max Engel, a suspected Jewish crime boss, and the records document that he received inflated rents from the prostitutes who lived there, 2 or 3 times what other tenants paid per month. The high profile of Engel and the investigation into the police captain in that precinct explain the extensive records for this particular address. The investigation of the building culminated with a criminal trial against Engel and the arrest of several residents in the building. However, Engel did not live in the building and did not take part in the daily operations of the building. The sources indicate that Mrs. Engel took an active role in the management of the building, again without living there. This highlights how women, and particularly Jewish women, had a large amount of control over the businesses surrounding prostitution, as well as the business of prostitution itself during the time period. The extensive nature of the records for 102 Allen Street means we get a closer look at the daily lives of the people who live there, both those who participated in commercialized vice and those who did not. People who lived in this building among the prostitutes but did not participate in the business of prostitution had opinions about the issue that can be found in these records. Additionally, 2 investigators, Max Moskowitz and Jacob Kreisworth, who we've already talked about, lived in this building at the time of the investigation. Moskowitz lived there with his wife and baby. At the time when Moskowitz and Kreisworth lived at 102 Allen Street, they embodied this dual role of neighbor and investigator. And in analyzing the ways they interacted with the other residents of the building, we cannot separate these roles out. These investigators are one example of how the residents of 102 Allen Street benefited financially, if indirectly, from the prostitutes who lived there. The economic ecosystem included more than just people who profited off the sale of sex. Without the prostitutes, these investigators would not have lived at 102 Allen Street in the first place or earned their salary from the Committee of 15. So let's look at another image here, which is a directory from the Committee of 15 records that shows who is living in this building. Okay, 102 Allen Street gives us a rich cast of characters, and I'm not even going to talk about all of them today. We see on the second floor right here, the Wolfs, a married couple who are identified as Hester and Henry Wolf. They are the managers of the property. They had the title of janitor and housekeeper, respectively. Men who came, their apartment was the hub of activity for the building. Men came there, they would gamble, they would drink, and they would also meet prostitutes. While the actual sex happened in other apartments, this is where it all began. This is where the night would start. Hester would also serve as a lookout for the police. She would warn prostitutes to stay inside or hide when the police walked by, and she would stonewall the police when they asked her questions about prostitution in the building. Their daughters, Rosie, Nellie, and Katie, sold sex, often meeting their clients in their parents' apartment before taking them upstairs to another building. If we now look up to the third floor, we see Mary Benjamin right here. She acted as the madam for the building as well as a prostitute herself. If the Wolf's apartment served as the social center of the building, Benjamin was the sexual center. We can also see on the third floor right here, Max Moskowitz lived across the hall from Mary Benjamin, and Jacob Kreisworth here also lived on that floor. So these investigators are living on the same floor as the madam of the building, which we'll get into the implications of that a little bit later. Now, if you look up, well, not every resident participated in the pleasure economy directly. The business of pleasure and entertainment impacted the lives of everybody who lived here. We see this in the records with 2 families, the Hoffmans here who lived on the 4th floor, and the Yarmuses, who are not listed on this directory because they had already moved out by the time it was created. These people had a variety of reaction to living with prostitutes. The Yarmus family, who lived in the apartment that is here listed as vacant, moved out of the building, but before they moved out, they had a lot of complaints about it. Jenny Hoffman, who lived here on the 4th floor, we see capitalized on it by doing laundry and mending for the prostitute women in the building. Now, if you're looking at this image, you see here at the bottom a key. Anytime you see a D, a DH, or a DW is places that were suspected to have some kind of prostitution, disorderly house where business is done, and disorderly women who lived there. So you can see there are no fewer than 4 apartments that have disorderly people. You can also see that most of those apartments are on the 1st and 3rd floor, with the 2nd floor having the Wolf's apartment, which was that social center, which is going to, again, we're going to talk about later, Jenny Hoffman and her way of navigating living among the buildings of prostitution. Okay, so let's get back to the show. Okay, so the thoroughness of the records for 102 Allen Street allows it to serve as a touchstone for many of the themes that I want to talk about today. By looking at this tenement and others like it, we can see how prostitutes conducted their daily lives, what they valued, how they understood their place in the sexual economy, as well as the broader consumer culture, and how sexual culture was theorized and created by various actors. We can also see how prostitutes influenced their neighbors' lives, both those who tolerated living with them and those who benefited from living among them. And those who found, both those who tolerated living with them, those who benefited from living among them, and those who found living in the same space as prostitution intolerable. In the tenements, we see families who work together in this illicit economy. Sisters lived together as they both sold sex. Older women acted as a madam for their younger relatives. Parents and their adult children ran small businesses within the pleasure economy that included selling alcohol, gambling, and sex. Sometimes the investigators did not believe that the people who purported to be related actually were. This opens up questions about why people would say that they were related if they were not, and why investigators hesitated to believe it. By looking at the ways members of this illicit economy constructed and defined families, we can delve into the meaning of family, respectability, and working class financial imperatives. I'm going to share now with you a page from the 1900 census, which includes part of 102 Allen Street. So the highlighted section I'm about to talk about are the Wolf family. Right below them are the Yarmus family that I had said had moved out of the building by the time the investigation came to be. And down here is Benchik, is how it's written in the census, and Mary Benchik. That's Mary Benjamin, our madam here. So just so you know what you're looking at, you can sort of see that these people, where they were born, where their parents were born, it's a pretty cool and interesting document. So it can be seen the ways that but talking about the ways that families are constructed and defined can be seen very clearly with the Wolf family at 102 Allen Street. Nellie and Rosie Wolf are listed on the census as daughters to Hester and Henry. However, investigators had reason to believe that they were not actually the couple's daughters. Moskowitz reported, quote, "The housekeeper's family seems to be increasing with daughters. The daughters go as no respectable woman would go around the house," end quote. Moskowitz defined these women by their familial relationship, while also criticizing the Wolfs as parents for not ensuring their daughters act respectably. When he says, quote, "the daughters go as no respectable woman would," he both defines them by the real or fictive familial relationship and questions that relationship because of the lack of respectability. The implication is that it is the responsibility of the parents to ensure their daughter's proper behavior. Often, the idea that women were not actually that these particular women were not actually daughters is voiced by the investigators as a suspicion without any real evidence. But on this occasion, Moskowitz said, quote, "What surprises me a great deal, the father and mother are Americans and speak English fluently. The daughters speak with a foreign accent," end quote. Claiming familiar relationships seems to be one strategy to feign respectability, even though this family did not try to hide their activities from the other residents of the building or from the men who visited the building. However, we could also see the Wolfs claiming these young women as daughters as the formation of a chosen family that lived and worked together. This tenement functioned as an economic ecosystem of small and micro businesses. And as Hasia Diner has argued, for Jewish immigrants in this time period, quote, "small business meant family business," end quote. The Wolfs can be seen as identifying these young women as daughters because of this phenomenon. Where people worked together from their homes, they understood themselves to be family. the family could be a more fluid concept than the investigators gave it credit for. One thing we see when we look at the tenements that is absent from other spaces in the city is children. We cannot look at understandings of prostitution and sexual culture without taking children into consideration. Again, thinking back to that video and how we saw children playing on the street, thinking back to Michael Gold's book and the ways that he was 5 years old when he saw all of these things that he was writing about. Children observed and in their own way experienced the sexual culture of the tenements. This fact concerned the reformers a great deal. The Committee of 15's publication, The Social Evil, shows us this attitude. Quote, "The child who knows all evil is almost destined to share in it. No child over the age of 3 should be permitted in a house where prostitution is carried on," end quote. The committee's investigators always note whether or not there are children in the building as a reflection of this attitude toward children and prostitution. However, this idea does not take into consideration that some of the children over the age of 3 who, quote, lived in a house where prostitution is carried on are actually the children of prostitutes. These sources tell us what the reformers thought about the effects of prostitutes had on children's morality, what investigators believed about prostitutes interacted with children, and how, in some cases, prostitutes utilized children to their own ends. I'm actually not going to be, I don't think, talking about how prostitutes utilize children to their own ends, but there are some sources that say that prostitutes would pretend a child was there to feign respectability, or pretend a child was theirs in order to entice a man into believing that she was a good woman. So that's some of the ways that we see that I'm not going to be talking about in more depth. The richness of the sources on 102 Allen Street also give us the perspective of some of the children themselves. So let's talk about the Yarmus boys. 12-year-old Isaac Yarmus and his brother, 14-year-old Louis Yarmus, lived at 102 Allen Street and navigated a world where prostitution was part of their daily lives. They, quote, "heard those women called nafkis," which, by the way, in case you didn't know, is the Yiddish word for prostitute, say to men, "come up," end quote. Louis Yarmus testified that the women who would whistle at men as they beckoned them inside from the stoop or the window. The boy's father, Michael, noted that in the summertime, prostitutes, quote, "were as numerous as the bees in the hive," end quote. The boys clearly saw and understood who their neighbors were, and in a small way, they tell us how that impacted their lives. The first thing the deposition of the Yarmus brothers tells us is that they knew that prostitution was illegal. They watched as Hester Wolf served as a lookout for the prostitutes and, quote, "said to the nafkis, 'go inside,' when she saw a policeman or a detective coming along the street," end quote. Here we see that not only did they understand the implications a policeman had for the prostitutes of the building, they also understood some of the managerial structure of the tenement. While Hester Wolf was not a prostitute herself, it was clear to the Yarmuses that she had a role in the business structure. They did not just see and hear. Isaac and Louis Yarmus also interacted with the prostitutes who lived in the building themselves. Isaac reported that he, quote, went on the stoop, the nafkis would take my hat and throw it into the street and tell me to keep away from the stoop," end quote. While a stoop should have been a public space available to all the residents of the building, the prostitutes of 102 Allen Street claimed it as their own. Prostitutes paid business rates for their rent, as opposed to the residential rates the Yarmuses paid, and therefore felt more entitled to control the public spaces of this building. And now when I'm saying business rates, I just mean that those inflated rents that the Engels were charging to the prostitutes compared to the other residents. In this way, 102 Allen Street functioned as kind of a hybrid residential commercial space, and the income brought in by the commercial tenants entitled them to privileges regarding what space they used. Prostitutes also antagonized both boys by throwing their hats into the street. This contestation over space on the stoop led some prostitutes to hire boys to keep the stoop clear, and in doing so, injected more capital into the economic system. One mother in the building complained, quote, "Kitty kept a watch boy on the street to keep the children off the stoop so that the woman could do business," end quote. This woman also said that she never let her own, quote, "children sit on the stoop. I was afraid they would be spoiled," end quote. In this mother, whose 6-year-old son said to her, quote, "the women call men from the street, the women do bad business," end quote, we can see that for many of these Jewish immigrant parents, they were doing their best to try and protect their children from the so-called corrupting impact of living among prostitutes. The concern about the influence that prostitutes had on the children in the neighborhood was not unfounded. One man reported, quote, "I have seen a little boy standing under the stairs and a little girl on the stoop, and the little girl made goo-goo eyes at the little boy and called him in," end quote. This neighbor is concerned that these children imitated the actions of prostitutes and their customers and imply a concern that this girl will become a prostitute herself and the boy will grow into somebody who uses prostitutes. The concern neighbors have about prostitutes on the streets is tied to the concerns over the morality of the neighborhood as a whole and the children specifically. This is a game that happens on the front step of the building, indicating that this kind of visibility of prostitution is seen regularly in this space and that it feels like an appropriate place for children to play such a game. While reformers and parents had concerns about the moral effects prostitutes would have on children who lived in the same building, we cannot ignore the way that prostitution in urban spaces impacted the quotidian concerns of people who live side by side with prostitutes. When we look at the day-to-day of these experiences, we can see a variety of ways that neighbors either tolerated or resented the prostitutes in their building and their neighborhoods. The ways that living in the building with prostitutes impacted committee investigator Max Moskowitz as a neighbor differed from what the committee might have expected. On his first night in his new home, he and his family, quote, "were kept awake until 3 o'clock in the morning through the continuous comings and goings of men into the premises and the loud talking," end quote. Moskowitz's objection was the disruption to his sleep. Most of his complaints have to do with loud noise, shouting and fighting, and the effects that had on his wife and baby. He said in a deposition, quote, "the peace and comfort of himself and his family were continually disturbed," end quote. Oftentimes, these men would knock on the doors of the apartment where no prostitutes lived because a prostitute had occupied the apartment in the past. You can see that when we looked at that directory. Moskowitz had several conversations with another tenant, Jenny Hoffman, about how she managed to live in the building with prostitutes. Now, I'm just going to pause here and say Jenny Hoffman is one of my favorite people in all of American history, and I think hopefully it'll become clear why as we go along. On one occasion, she, quote, "said to me, there are 3 rooms on the top floor, which would be all right for me and my wife, as we could not see what was going on this floor," end quote. So remember, Hoffman lived 1 floor above the Moskowitzes. Hoffman saw that the Moskowitzes were disturbed by the prostitution and offered a practical solution to the problem. Hoffman shows us that for the people who lived in the neighborhood and had to coexist with prostitution, the aim was not necessarily to clean it up or reform the morals of women. In many ways, Hoffman accepted prostitutes as her neighbors and adjusted her life so that their lifestyle did not disturb her. And when possible, she used her position as their neighbor to her own advantage. Because Jenny Hoffman was a savvy woman who was paying attention to how the Engels and the Wolves ran the business of the building. She also participated in the economic ecosystem, as she told Moskowitz that the prostitutes in the building hired her to wash and sew their clothing, quote, "which enables me to live," end quote. When the landlord threatened to evict her if she did not pay her rent, she replied, quote, "I will not move. There is a woman on the 3rd floor who pays you $20 rent. Why don't you bother her?" End quote. While the non-prostitute tenants reported paying $8, $8.50, or $10 a month. So we see it's about double. After this, the landlord no longer bothered Hoffman, and she paid her rent when it was convenient for her. In each interaction Moskowitz had with Hoffman, we see that she accepted living in the same building as prostitutes, found a way to structure her life so it didn't disturb her peace. And more interestingly, she profited off the sex workers in the building and used her knowledge of the way that money flowed between customer, prostitute, and landlord and herself to her own advantage. She later testified for the committee, but not without financial incentive. Jacob Kreisworth, our other investigator who lived in the building, reported, quote, "Mrs. Hoffman is a very important witness. She said if the committee of 15 will pay her for the trouble, she is willing to testify and say everything she knows about 102 Allen Street," end quote. Hoffman saw and understood what was happening in the building and in a small way profited off it by providing domestic services to the prostitutes. But her willingness to testify was more about money. She required payment than it was about a desire to clean up the building. With Hoffman, we see a women's perspective that is missing from the investigator's report. She displays an awareness of how these women went about their business, but nothing about her testimony or the investigator's reports of her conversations indicate any kind of moral condemnation. As a working class woman, there are some ways that she had more in common with the prostitutes than the investigators or other male tenants. Like many of the prostitutes in this time period, especially those who were mothers, she needed a place to raise her children and enough money to do so. Instead of condemnation, she demonstrated tolerance and found a way to profit off the situation so she could feed, clothe, and house her own children. However, not every neighbor reacted to living with prostitutes in the same practical way as Jenny Hoffman, who seemed to understand the fact that prostitutes paid more rent entitled them to certain privileges in the building. As we saw with Louis and Isaac Yarmus, the family had different expectations of their life at 102 Allen Street. By the time the investigation got underway, the Yarmus family had already moved out of the building 2 blocks away. This was a very kind of insular neighborhood. According to Becky Yarmus, the boy's mother, the family, quote, was served with a dispossess notice to move because she would not scrub the halls to suit the prostitutes, end quote. Here is another example of how this family did not adapt their expectations of their place in the building based on the hybrid model of the tenement. Perhaps management expected every tenant to keep their portion of the hallway clean, but the fact that the prostitutes complaining could result in eviction demonstrated the centrality of prostitution to the economic profitability for the owners. Additionally, this shows how the managers and the prostitutes in the building expected all of the tenants to support their business through their domestic labor. In a tenement building that housed a large number of prostitute women, prostitution served as the nucleus for all of the tenants and impacted the lives of everyone who lived there. Each tenant could make the decision on how they reacted to this. They could accept it and profit from it, like Hoffman, or they could reject it and be rejected by the building in turn, like Yarmouth. Take a pause, because we're transitioning now to the actual sale of sex at 102 Allen Street. Mary Benjamin acted as both a prostitute and a sort of manager or madam. Sometimes Benjamin entertained the men who came to her door herself, but she would also often call for Nellie Wolfe, for example, one of Hester and Henry's daughters, to come up to service the men. For Benjamin, the fact that Nellie was a younger woman, prone to staying out late for her own amusement, could be a problematic distraction for the other prostitutes in the business. Benjamin complained to Jenny Hoffman. And again, we see Jenny Hoffman interacting with Mary Benjamin in a more social way. So she complains to Jenny Hoffman that, quote, Nellie Wolfe was not much good for business because she went out to the theaters too much and she, meaning Benjamin, had to send customers away, end quote. Benjamin obviously took the business part of her profession more seriously than Wolfe, who preferred her own amusement. One possible explanation for this different attitude towards the sale of sex is age. The Wolfe daughters appear to be in their late teens or early 20s, while Benjamin is listed on the 1900 census as being 32 years old. The Wolfe daughters were also unmarried, while Benjamin had a husband. As a married woman in her mid-30s, Benjamin had passed the point of life where she could view prostitution as a temporary lifestyle to support her own amusement. She was a responsible businesswoman who took the way she earned her money very seriously. As the manager of the tenement prostitutes, she played a vital role in this ecosystem of earning, and when others failed to earn, she felt the loss in her own bottom line. By running their own businesses and finances like Mary Benjamin did, madams filled a role that was often reserved for men in this time. In very few industries could a woman be her own boss, employ a number of workers, and have a personal and professional autonomy. And most of the businesses available for women to play these roles, women were earning from other women, beauty parlors and dressmakers, for example. In this industry, women earned their money from men, which gave their customers more disposable income, which in turn allowed prostitutes and madams to earn more money than other female business owners. In the private space of the tenements, we can see some of the intricacies of female-run businesses that are invisible in more public spaces. The ways that women ran their business or acted as saleswomen show that for many, being a prostitute was more than just about sexual labor. It required a certain kind of business savvy. Based on the testimony of one of her neighbors, we can see how Mary Benjamin understood space, economics, and the running of her business. As we saw, the prostitutes who lived at 102 Allen Street paid more rent than other tenants. Jenny Hoffman marked the difference as $20 instead of $10 per month. Michael Yarmus, the father of our Isaac and Lewis, testified that Benjamin would say, quote, "I am paying $80 per month and the other people sitting on the stoop will interfere with my business." End quote. Complaining that there were other people sitting in a space that she felt entitled to. We saw earlier that the Yarmus brothers found that the prostitutes who hung out on the stoop drumming up business would abuse those boys. Here we see their father reporting this was an explicit right that the woman who paid more in the rent felt entitled to. For Benjamin, the increased rent was not just a fee her landlord extorted out of her so that she wouldn't be harassed. She's indicating that the money bought her access to the public and outdoor space of the building with which to conduct her business. At one point, Moskowitz visited the landlord, Max Engel, to complain about the prostitution in the building. Quote, "The owner told him that if he was so thin-skinned, he would have to move," end quote. In many of the reports from this address, Engel disavows any knowledge of the daily goings-on at Allen Street and states that the running of the building falls to the Wolves. The family of the Wolves, not the Wolves. Engel related the story to Henry Wolf, who, quote, "thought the man who made the complaint was a stool pigeon, and if he came where he was, he would tell him so," end quote. While within these interactions, we see that Moskowitz earning from the committee, but also paying Engel rent, who pays Henry Wolf his salary. Engel also earns from prostitutes who earn from their customers, some of who are investigators for the committee. While the committee members and Engel do not enter the building, they both impact the microeconomy of 102 Allen Street and the fluid exchange of money around prostitution in the building. I know that was like a kind of complicated thing, but my point being that money is really flowing in multiple directions within the tenements of the Jewish Lower East Side. So let's go back to the incident that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, where a detective from the Eldridge Street station came to the tenement and knocked on all the doors of 102 Allen Street. As Kreisworth reported, quote, "He asked me if I knew of any disorderly girls in the house. I told him I did not know anybody who kept disorderly girls. He then went to every apartment in the house and asked the same questions. Every tenant in the house told the detective there were no disorderly girls. Nearly every tenant in the house makes a living off these girls," end quote. That's a repetition of what I said at the beginning, but just to refresh our memories. While it would be easy to say that Kreisworth was being hyperbolic, we know that at least 4 apartments in this building housed prostitutes, including Mary Benjamin, who directed customers to the right apartment to find an available woman. 2 apartments housed investigators whose income came because prostitutes lived in the building and reformers thought that needed investigation. 1 apartment housed the Wolves, who profited in multiple ways from the prostitutes in the building, and 1 apartment housed Jenny Hoffman, who did work for prostitutes and ultimately also took the committee's money to testify against those same prostitutes. As Kreisworth put it, quote, "making a living off of these girls." All of this is to say that the Jewish immigrants on the Lower East Side, particularly those who lived in the same spaces as prostitutes, did often make a living off the sale of sex, and it was a visible and integral part of the Jewish immigrant experience in the early 20th century New York. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. That was really, really interesting. I mean, obviously, the topic of prostitution on the Lower East Side, it can be really broad. There are plays about it, from the early 20th century. The Yiddish press of the period is full of articles about it. So I think this approach that you've taken, this sort of macro approach to, a tenement house, really kind of, is a vivid way to explore this issue, among Jewish immigrants on the Lower East Side. I think it's really it was really fascinating to me.
Thank
Uh,
you.
I'm just wondering, how did you get to this topic? I'm, just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in the early 20th century. It was always kind of the thing. And I'm also interested in questions of gender and sexuality and power and sort of how, and I'm just really, it's a kind of a longer story. I thought I would make a documentary back in 2009, well before I went to grad school. And I found actually Rosie and what was her husband's name? Jacob Hertz, who are some of the biggest of these crime, like part of the crime syndicate, who had a lot of prostitutes, and I thought I might make a movie about them, but I put it to the back burner. And when I came back to grad school, I sort of was like, oh, let me pick this back up, and it just kind of exploded from there.
Wow, interesting. I just want to mention if anyone has any questions for Dina, please leave them in the Q&A section of the Zoom. And if not, I'm just wondering, you focused on this, this one building. I don't know what the rest of your, how you approach the rest of it in your dissertation, but I assume, you take a broader view, at
Yeah.
one point or another. How else are you exploring these issues in your work?
Sure. So the dissertation is actually kind of divided by space. And this building is the kind of the backbone of the tenements chapter. But I also have a chapter that is in process of being written now about the streets. One about saloons and other spaces of socialization, and one about theaters, and burlesque and vaudeville. So that's sort of the way I'm doing it. And yes, when it came to the tenements, it really, like, 102 Allen Street has so many sources that it's hard to not focus on it. But the chapter itself does have other buildings in it, but it really is kind of like this the backbone of the chapter. But looking at each space kind of gives us a little bit. The streets give us about how people negotiate space a little bit more, the saloons a little bit more about the sexual culture and the ways that prostitutes are constructing that, and the theaters sort of the interrelated ways that performance and advertising and commerce are all interacting with each other. And then the last chapter is the sales chapter, which goes into every single space and talks about the different ways that sales functions in those spaces.
Right. And I'm curious, I don't know exactly what sources you're using. Obviously, you mentioned some of them. But I'm curious to know if, because Yiddish was sort of the lingua franca of the Lower East Side, during this period, I'm curious to know how Yiddish figures in,
Yeah.
in some of your sources, on this topic.
Yeah, I very, very unfortunately do not speak or read Yiddish. However, in the sources, for Jacob Kriesworth actually was a big translator. So there are a lot of things that Jacob Kriesworth, the investigator I was talking about, translated letters that were written to the committees from Yiddish to English so that I could read them. And presumably the native born might the native born. There were a couple of Jewish members of the committee too, Felix Adler and Seligman, whose first name I'm for Edwin Seligman, I think. But like for the most part, these are a bunch of Christian dudes. But like translating for the committee as well. So I am reliant on the translations that the people in the time did, and translations of things like Shalom Ach's, the
God of vengeance.
Yeah. All the words are escaping me today, but yeah, like translations of things are really what I'm relying on for this for my purposes.
Right.
I wasn't allowed to take Yiddish in college.
Yeah, I can only suggest that you learn Yiddish as
I know.
as fast as
I don't
possible.
know if my brain could take it at this point, but I wish I did. I really do wish I did, because I know that the whole project would be so much richer if I could get into those Yiddish sources. But
I mean, it may not be richer, but it would certainly be different. Like
it would be.
it would provide different sources for you. Like I do know that
Yeah.
the press is just full of material.
I know. And I see when I look through, when I mine other people's footnotes and whatever, I am seeing so many interesting things. And so I am, and they're not completely unavailable to me because of some translations, but I can't, look at them myself, unfortunately.
Right. And so what's interesting about this tenement house that you've discussed, is that it, to a certain degree, it's a whorehouse. It's
Yep.
the whole building is involved with this activity. And I'm just wondering if there's other. I mean, obviously at the time it's considered prostitution is considered a crime, and I'm wondering if there's other criminal activity in the building or adjacent to it. I know that somewhere near there was an opium den, like a Jewish run opium den on Allen Street. What else is around to sort of like fill out the context
Yeah, gambling is the other big thing that's completely intertwined, right? Like you go to the Wolf's house, they would be gambling. There's a lot of gambling. Originally, the Committee of 15 was going to actually investigate both prostitution and gambling. They put gambling to the side for reasons, but it's still part of those sources, and you can still see the ways that the men would go play cards and then they would go to have women, and like it's really very closely intertwined. For sure there are opium dens. Not, I mean, you were in the Lower East Side, which is very Jewish, but it's very close also to Chinatown, which also had a lot of opium dens as well. There's a concern about white slavery in Chinatown, white slavery being like the contemporary term for human trafficking. But like, and then also like all of the other Jewish, like underworld Jewish crime that you see with, what's her name's, and all those, which there's plenty of literature on Jewish crime that I'm tapping into. But yeah, it's all part of it there.
Right, right. Really interesting. You know what? If I don't know if anyone has questions, but if you do, this is going to be the last call for them. Okay, I guess we have a shy audience today. But this was really a terrific lecture, really genuinely fascinating.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. So thanks everybody for joining us. This has been a YIVO Max Weinreich Fellowship Lecture in American Jewish Studies. This was funded by the Rose and Isidore Drench Memorial Fellowship and the Dora and Mayer Tendler Endowed Fellowship. And I should add that Barbara Drench, who was one of the funders of the Rose and Isidore Drench Memorial Fellowship, usually joins us, but unfortunately wasn't able to today. So I'm sure she'll watch this on YouTube at a later date. And our lecturer today has been Dina Ecker, who was the recipient of this fellowship in American Jewish Studies for 2024-2025 at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And if you enjoyed this, please consider making a donation. We can't fund graduate students and scholars without your support. So we appreciate anyone who is willing to help out. Okay, have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the funding and for the support and for having me here today.
All right, thank you. It's great.